Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're diving into the story of the Denisovans. This is a really fascinating group of ancient humans, and it's a story that's really mostly told through their DNA. We don't have a whole lot of skeletal remains to go on, but what we do have tells a really intriguing story.
Yeah, and it really shows how much we can learn now from ancient DNA. It's like opening up a new window into the past.
Exactly. So our journey into the Denisovan world starts in a place called Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Back in 2008, archaeologists were working there, and they found a small piece of a finger bone, a fragment, right alongside some Neanderthal tools. And that little piece of bone, which they labeled Denisova 3, that little piece of bone, ended up changing everything.
It really did. And that little piece of bone ended up in the lab of a geneticist named Svante Pääbo. You might recognize that name because he ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 2022 for his work on ancient DNA, particularly on sequencing the Neanderthal genome and revealing a lot of secrets about our own past.
So this was a big deal, right? His team analyzed the DNA from this finger bone, and it wasn't Neanderthal. It wasn't modern human. It was something else entirely.
It was a complete surprise. And in 2010, they announced the discovery of this brand new group of ancient humans, the Denisovans. And you can imagine all the questions that came up. Who were they? What did they look like? Where did they live? How were they related to us? And a lot of those questions we are still trying to answer.
So were the Denisovans a completely separate species like Neanderthals? Or were they like a subspecies of Homo sapiens? I know there's still some debate going on about how to classify them, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's a really tricky question. And it speaks to how complex our evolutionary history really is. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as Homo denisova and sometimes Homo altiensis. It's still a matter of ongoing discussion and research. We have these tantalizing bits of genetic information, but we don't have a complete picture yet.
Okay, so in this deep dive, we're going to explore what we do know about the Denisovans. We'll start with those discoveries in Denisova Cave, and then we'll look at how their story has expanded beyond that cave to other parts of the world. And we'll talk about their relationship with Neanderthals and with us and what we can glean about their appearance and their lifestyle.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's talk about Denisova Cave for a bit. It wasn't just that one finger bone, right? There have been other Denisovan remains found there over the years.
Right, Denisova Cave has actually yielded quite a few Denisovan fossils, though most of them are pretty fragmentary. Besides that finger bone, Denisova 3, there's a tooth, a molar, called Denisova 4. And that was actually found back in 2000, before they even knew what a Denisovan was.
Oh, wow. So it was just sitting there in a collection somewhere waiting to be identified.
Exactly. Then there's another tooth, a baby tooth from a young female. That's called Denisova 2. And this one's much older, maybe as old as 194,000 years. There's another upper molar, Denisova 8, from around 2010. And then there's this really interesting fragment of a long bone that's called Denisova 11. And that dates to about 50,000 years ago. And what makes that one so fascinating is that it turned out to be from a hybrid individual, someone with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father.
Whoa, wait a minute. We're going to come back to that because that is super cool. But first, I just want to make sure I'm following you on the timeline here. So these discoveries in Denisova Cave, they're all from different periods, right? It wasn't like they all lived there at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Denisovans seem to have lived in Denisova Cave on and off, or maybe even continuously, for a really long time, like tens of thousands of years. That Denisova 4 molar, for example, that one is older than Denisova, and Denisova 8 is at least 50,000 years older than Denisova 3. So they were definitely around for a while.
Okay, so for a long time, Denisova Cave was like the only place we knew Denisovans had lived. But in recent years, there have been discoveries in other parts of Asia, right?
Exactly. In 2018, scientists found part of a jawbone, a mandible, in a cave called Baishia Cave, high up on the Tibetan plateau. And they were able to use a technique called paleoproteomics to analyze the proteins in that jawbone. And it turned out to be Denisovan.
So they weren't just hanging out in Siberia then.
No, they weren't. And that discovery on the Tibetan plateau is really significant because it shows that Denisovans were able to adapt to very different environments, including high altitudes. We think that modern Tibetans actually inherited some of their adaptations for living at high altitudes from the Denisovans.
Wow, that's incredible. So from a single finger bone in a Siberian cave, we're now seeing Denisovans living on the roof of the world. And they've been found even further afield, right? I remember something about a discovery in Laos.
You're right. In 2022, scientists found a molar, a tooth, in a cave called Cobra Cave in Laos. And this tooth dates back to between 164,000 and 131,000 years ago. So that pushes their range even further south into Southeast Asia.
So from the cold of Siberia to the heights of the Tibetan Plateau and now down into the tropics, that really changes our view of where Denisovans lived and how adaptable they were.
Absolutely. They were clearly a very successful and widespread group of hominins. And this brings us to the question of their relationships with other ancient humans, particularly with Neanderthals and with us, modern humans.
Okay, so we know that Neanderthals and Denisovans were closely related, right? They kind of split off from a common ancestor, right?
Yeah, exactly. Scientists estimate that Neanderthals and Denisovans diverged from a common ancestor somewhere around 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. So think of them as like sister lineages on the human family tree. What's even more interesting is that we know they weren't completely isolated from each other after they split. They still interacted, and they even interbred.
Okay, so let's talk about interbreeding. We know that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, right? And there's evidence that we also interbred with Denisovans.
Right, you got it. We know that most people of non-African descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, about 2 to 4% on average. And we also know that people of Melanesian ancestry, they carry a significant amount of Denisovan DNA, somewhere between 4 and 6%.
So somewhere in our past, our ancestors met and mingled with both Neanderthals and Denisovans. It's like a big family reunion, but, way back in time.
It really is. And it's rewriting the way we think about human evolution. It's not a simple straight line. It's more like a tangled web of interactions and connections.
And to add to that tangled web, you mentioned earlier that there's evidence that different groups of Denisovans might have interbred with each other as well.
Yeah, that's right. Some of the genetic data suggests that there might have been at least 3 distinct Denisovan lineages, and that they weren't completely isolated from each other. It's possible that they were more like a network of interconnected groups spread across Asia. And do you remember that Denisov 11 individual we talked about? The one with the Neanderthal mother and the Denisovan father? That's direct evidence that these two groups were interbreeding.
Okay, so that brings us to the question of what the Denisovans actually looked like. And I know that's a tough one because we just don't have that many fossils.
It really is. We have to piece together what we can from the few bones and teeth we have and from their DNA. So based on the DNA from that Denisova 3 finger bone, scientists think that she probably had dark skin, brown eyes, and brown hair. And the teeth, the molars that we found, they're really interesting. They're bigger than Neanderthal molars and bigger than modern human molars. And they have these really robust roots, which suggests they were adapted for chewing tough foods.
So we're starting to get a glimpse of what they might have looked like. And there's also some evidence that they had adaptations for living at high altitudes, right?
Yes, exactly. Scientists have found a gene variant in modern Tibetans that helps them adapt to low oxygen levels at high altitudes. And it turns out that this gene variant came from Denisovans. So that's another piece of the puzzle, and it tells us something about the environments they were living in.
Wow, so they were giving us gifts even back then.
That's one way to look at it.
Okay, so we've talked about where they lived, who they were related to, and what they might have looked like. What about their lifestyle? Do we know anything about what they ate or what kind of tools they used?
Well, again, it's tricky because the evidence is limited. But from what we can tell, they seem to have been pretty adaptable, like we talked about earlier, living in all kinds of different environments.
Hmm.
And based on some recent analysis of a molar from Cobra Cave in Laos, it looks like they were eating a mix of plants and animals, kind of like a hunter-gatherer diet.
Okay, so to sum things up, the Denisovans are this fascinating group of ancient humans that we're only just beginning to understand. We know they were widespread across Asia, that they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans, and that they had some unique adaptations like the ability to live at high altitudes. But there's still so much we don't know.
Absolutely. And that's what makes them so exciting to study. Every new discovery has the potential to change our understanding of human evolution. And the fact that we can learn so much from just a few scraps of bone and a little bit of DNA it's just amazing.
It really makes you wonder what else is out there waiting to be discovered.
I know, right? It's like we're just starting to scratch the surface of our own past.
And that's what makes this so fascinating. We're not just learning about some ancient group of people who are long gone. We're learning about ourselves, about where we came from, and about the deep connections that link us to the rest of humanity, both past and present.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of our world. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one to make the next big discovery that changes everything.